There's a difference, I guess. And he says that he had a ride in that UFO. Now, that is a contactee story. Okay, fine. But as contactee stories go, this one is mundane, almost. It's certainly not as wild as some of the ones you have heard. Let me give you a little bit of background information on Dan Fry. He is an engineering executive. He's a lecturer and a world traveler. Participated in the organization of the Crescent Engineering and Research Company in 1940, became its vice president in 1956. He was one of the prime movers in the Crescent liquid fuel missile program, begun in 1945, been employed in the development of the science of rocketry for more than 30 years. Dr. Fry was declared an associate member of the Crackpot Society in 1945 because he stated publicly that he expected to see astronauts in orbit around the Earth during his lifetime. And he was promoted to the position of super crackpot in 1947 when he declared that he expected to live to see astronauts land safely on the moon. He has written a number of books, been the editor of the Understanding magazine since 1956. He's been listed in Who's Who in the West, National Social Register, the Blue Book, World Who's Who in Finance and Industry, and so forth. I wanted to get Dan Fry here because I've heard some of his other talks that he's given. I always found them extremely interesting, and I think you will too. His topic today is the White Sands incident today. He's going to add to and update that original story, and of course at the end, if you have some questions, we will try to find time for them. So, Daniel Fry.
It wasn't mentioned in the introduction that I am also a peacenik. That is, I do things to keep the world put together. And I'm going to start out by reading you a little poem that I wrote once going up to Vancouver, British Columbia, the peace meeting there. It isn't a nice poem. It's kind of a nasty poem. But it does make people think. And it has been printed a few places since then. The World Council had adjourned in total disarray. The bewildered statesmen shook their heads in anger and dismay. What can we do, the leader said. They will not compromise, nor will they yield a single point, though it cost them their lives. Negotiation now has failed, and force will take its place. Tonight the missiles will be armed, tomorrow they may fly. Before another sun has set, half of the world may die. That night I tried in vain to sleep, but in my mind I saw the huge, horrendous mushroom crowds. Destruction stark and raw. The poem was called "The Day the Mushrooms Grew." That night I tried in vain to sleep, but in my mind I saw the huge, horrendous mushroom crowds. Destruction stark and raw. Throughout the land I heard the sound of screams and anguished moans. His blinded eyes were closed in death, and charred flesh fell from mangled bones. The world's great cities disappeared in one huge, tremendous flash. And in each city millions died as pawns of that devil's game. I saw a world die that night because men's reason failed. Unthinking passion seized the reins and megadeath prevailed. In agony of mind I cried, "Oh God, is it too late for you to save mankind from such a fate?" I heard a quiet voice reply, "Man's fate is his to choose. He holds his future in his hands. His life is his to live or lose." "But Lord, we need your help," I cried. "Our reason is of no avail." We need a higher guidance now. Our own reason can but fail. I heard a quiet voice reply, man's reason is a sorry guide to chart his course in life. It's mostly sophistry, you know, and can cause pain and strife. If you would help man live in peace, remember these few words of mine. Logic and reason are tools of man, but understanding is divine.
Very good.
So, anyway, little things like that I do on the car while my wife's driving and I'm writing poetry on the way to amuse my guests. I do have a few notes, and I'm going to try to use the notes as much as possible, save the questions for later. Every person, regardless of their status in life, who has in any way experienced a contact with an extraterrestrial being or intelligence, and who mentions that fact in public, invariably meets with the same type of public reaction. It will be a small burst of publicity at the start, in the media, and it always accompanies such a report. Local newspapers, radio and television stations announce the report with comment and speculation. Throughout all of the comment, however, it is obvious to the listeners that there is no real acceptance of any possible factuality in the report. The interest and speculation all center around the reason that would cause a person to make such a ridiculous and impossible assertions. Is he drunk? No. On dope? No. Mentally afflicted so that they really believe the nonsense that they so sincerely report? Hardly anyone stops to consider the fact that the report might just possibly be the simple truth. There will be a certain number of people with ego motive very high who feel it necessary for them to attack such nonsense and to disprove it and to discredit the person entirely. Any person who has the temerity to maintain that this is fact. Therefore, they will attack viciously the morality, the sanity, the honesty of their victim, even though they know nothing whatever about that person. They feel they just have to destroy him because if it doesn't destroy him, what the person says will destroy them. Even though they know nothing whatever about the individual that they are slandering. Okay? The public soon becomes wary of these claims and counterclaims, and usually decides that the easiest way to deal with these claims is simply to forget the whole thing, which it promptly sets out to do. The result is that while such announcements of contact with extraterrestrials cause a brief period of excitement, it is almost entirely forgotten before the next one occurs. If anyone who examines carefully and sincerely the proofs and evidences in back of such events, which has been accumulating for the past few centuries. However, its factuality can no more be attacked than the moon, the sun, or the world itself. Of course, if anyone in their splendid isolation is determined that nothing shall enter their eyes, their ears, their minds, and they close them so tightly that nothing can enter, that is their privilege and their loss. But sometimes they remind me of the backwoods farmer and his wife who were visiting a large city for the first time in their lives. As they walked through the streets, they saw many things that were hard to understand and even harder to believe. But the end came when they reached what was seen to be a lot where a circus was being erected. In a small pen in a corner of the lot, a giraffe was standing, with his long neck held upward as he grazed on the leaves of the small tree on top of the tree. He looked long and hard at this giraffe for several minutes. He stared in awe at what he was seeing. Finally, with his jaw set and his shoulders squared, he turned to his wife. "Who do they think they're fooling, Martha?" he said. "We know that there ain't no such animal." That's just some of the way some of the people affect me when they say there is no such thing as a UFO when the UFOs are all around them. And all they would have to do is open their eyes and look. We know there ain't no such animal. I'm not here today to defend the reality of occasional visitation from space. Its reality has proven itself during centuries of time. My purpose here is simply to answer, if possible, some of the many questions that arise because of it. I have been asked to speak today on an event that has become almost ancient history. Other and somewhat similar events have occurred in the United States and other places from time to time throughout history, and will probably occur in the future in other parts of the world. Since they will probably continue to occur in the future, some of you may have heard of the event which has become known as the White Sands Incident. In fact, some of you may have heard of that event much oftener than they would wish. Consequently, I have been asked to speak not so much of the event itself as upon the significance that it may have for all of us today. The changes that have taken place in Earthman's thinking, his habits, and the growing realization that the life forms, instead of being found only upon this planet, may exist on every planet that has conditions suitable for it. And that this life may exist in situations, conditions, development, not only much greater than those on Earth, but much greater beyond his concept, any concept that his mind is able to create. For those of you who may not know of the White Sands Incident at all, which after the publicity it has had for the last 25 years or so, it seems to be impossible. But nevertheless, I realize it must exist. It occurred on the evening of July 4th, 1950, at what then was known as White Sands Proving Grounds, and now is known as the White Sands Missile Range. And I still carry a lifetime card allowing me access to that range at any time. Near Las Cruces, New Mexico. It was there on the historic evening just mentioned that a strange device, which I was certain could not have been created by any knowledge or power on earth at that time, descended slowly from the evening skies and came to rest on the desert sand a short distance from where I stood in unbelieving astonishment. The report of this event could not be published at the time. Well, nothing that was going on at White Sands could be published at the time. They had a very stiff secrecy there. But was published a few years later under the title of the White Sands Incident, which is now available under the title of To Men of Earth. Some of the copies of it are lying right on the table outside. You can see them as you go out. This tells in great detail how I learned that the craft was unoccupied but was directed by electronic signals from a much larger craft that was being used at that time. To take samples of Earth's atmosphere at ground level from various isolated points on the surface of the Earth. I also learned that through a communication device in the landing craft, that it was possible to exchange information with an operator in the control ship, not in the craft itself. There's no one in the craft itself. Because it was very difficult for me to accept the fact that the Earth could be visited by a race of beings from somewhere else, I was invited to board the device, remotely controlled sampling device, for a test flight to and over the city of New York, whose light pattern I could readily recognize because I'd come into New York many times from airplanes. Except that this was a little bit higher. I entered New York a little bit higher than I had ever entered it before. So that I might be convinced that this craft was indeed capable of performance that could not be duplicated by any technology on Earth. It was successful, and therefore I was convinced that it could not be duplicated by any technology on Earth, and therefore must have been made somewhere else. At the same time, I began to have the feeling that perhaps I should also be somewhere else, or would rather be. But I knew that to flee is to invite pursuit, and I didn't want to invite pursuit. The rabbit hardly ever starts out to run until the hunter hardly ever sees a rabbit until the rabbit has started to run. The rabbit, when he's staying still, is very hard to see. But anyway, I decided to just remain motionless and watch, see what happened. Hope that I survived long enough to... I first had an inclination to rush back to the base. I was several miles out from the base of White Sands, and gather up a couple of fellows who still were there. It was a holiday, of course, and most everyone was out of the base at the time. And I'd already taken several steps, and then I got a sudden mental picture of the position I would be in if I did get a few people to follow me out there, and found that the craft had taken off and there was nothing but a slightly crushed patch of brush. I knew that I would no longer be working in that industry. I knew that just as well as I could think of anything. Poor old Fry, we knew he was working too hard, and his mind had slipped a cog, and we had to put him out to graze for a while. So I dismissed the thought of going in and getting someone else, because it would take at least half an hour to do it, and I had no idea how... I had seen how easy it was for this craft to come in and land. I assumed that it could take off as readily as it came in. So why should it be there when I came back with somebody else? But what would I say to that person I came back with when he expected to see a spaceship and saw nothing but some crushed blood? It was done mentally, but I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, my mind was affected electronically at the time, so that I wouldn't go back, so I would stay there, because it landing there was on purpose to contact someone of Earth. I shan't read all of the notes that are here. I could just read notes and say, I hope you like the lecture. I won't do it. If there are any people here who really want to talk about this craft, I'll be glad to do it. It's just that I've done so many times, it seems like the world must be fully aware of everything I have to say by now. But anyway, does anyone would like to hear the description of the craft and so forth?
Yeah.
All right, fine. Fine, I'll do it. The way that I came to be walking out in the desert was because it was the 4th of July. I had been going to go into Las Cruces with the company car, but the company car got too crowded. I thought, well, I don't want to ride in there. Besides, I have a few things I need to do. I'll take the night bus into Las Cruces for a brief celebration. And about 6:30, 6:45, I went down to the test bay, dispatch area, and asked the man in charge of dispatches there when the last motor pool bus went into camp. And he said 7:30. And I said, good. It's now about 6:30. I'll have time to get a little snack at the officer's mess and get back here in time to get on the bus. When I did have a little snack and come back, it was a little after 7. I looked around and saw no bus on the line. I asked the bus dispatcher what happened, and he said, well, it took off as it always does at 7 o'clock. And that was not very good news to me, because I had no other way to get to Las Cruces outside of walking the 24 miles, which isn't a nice task, and I had no inclination to walk it. But I was a little perturbed at the man, and I asked him rather hotly how it was that he had told me it was going to leave at 7:30. And he remembered saying it, but he couldn't remember why. But I thought, well, he must have had something that he was going to do at 7:30, and he just automatically said 7:30. Anyway, I had to face the fact that the bus was gone and there was no way to get into Las Cruces. The only other thing to do was return to my room and study a book on heat transfer by a gentleman named James Cork. Some of you may have heard of him. He specialized in heat transfer. And I mention it because this is one of the things that I mentioned in my first book. And over 100 people wrote into the base to ask him if they had a library, and if the library contained a book called Heat Transfer by James Cork, and if I had it checked out on that date. The greatest effort I ever saw was made to discount that book in one way or another. Every single thing I said in the book was checked up on. If anything had been false, it would have come out. I said the moon was not yet up. I gave the time and said the moon had not yet risen, but was close to the horizon. 100 people rushed to their almanacs to see when the moon rose on that day, hoping that they would find it rose sometime in the morning and that it was false. Everything in that book was tested and checked, and tested and checked and tested. Because it was something that had actually happened. I just wrote it as it happened, that's all, and that's why they couldn't destroy it. The books that are made by imagination are easy to show to be false, but the books that are made from fact are a little bit tougher. And no one has ever found a word in that book that was not correct. Anyhow, I'm getting a little aside from the point. But you will, if you write a book on UFOs, your book will be tested that way. Everything you say in there, you better be careful and be sure it's the truth, because it'll be checked. And if it isn't true, you'll hear about it. So anyway, I went back to my room, started to study this little heat transfer by James Cork. And I'd been studying perhaps 15 minutes when the air conditioning system quit. We had a little liquid air conditioning system that was hopefully designed to moderate slightly the inferno that the safe deposit buildings become in July. If you haven't been there in July, you can't imagine what it's like. But also, they are so overloaded that they frequently stop functioning. Now, I could have repaired this, and this stopped about sundown in summertime. I could have fixed it. I could have set it back in operation. But the law there says that no one but servicemen are allowed to touch the company equipment. And so I suffered a little longer, and finally I gave up and slammed Mr. Cook's book shut. And thought, well, if I take a walk out in the cooler air, why, it'll probably be cooler now. The sun's down, and it'll get cooler faster than it will in these little one-story frame buildings that stay hot all night. So I strode out, and I thought I'd walk down to the test bay first, see if I can do anything there. Maybe get ready for a test or something. Anyhow, I can do something, and it will be cooler there than it is in this doggone building. I walked out, started down toward the test bay, which was about 2 miles. And I thought, well, it won't take long to walk the 2 miles. And I started down, and on the way, we passed a road that I realized I had never been over. There's a little side road, and it wanders out into the boondocks, and I'd never had any reason to be over it. But I had heard stories of some miners that had started mining there before the base was set up, and were allowed to continue as long as they didn't come in and bother anybody, come into base and bother anybody. So I thought, well, as long as I'm just out for a walk to see where it's cooler, why, this is as good as any place. So I started down this little road into the boondocks. And I'd walked perhaps half a mile, and there were some bright stars overhead. The sun was down, of course, and the moon hadn't come up yet. But even bright stars give plenty of light for comfortable hiking if you're out there. Stars are out. Why, you can read a newspaper, in fact, almost any time in the night out there, unless there is an overcast, and there wasn't on this particular night. Now, don't all rush to your papers to see if there was an overcast that night, because there wasn't. Anyhow, you find there wasn't. It was clear. But I started out on this side road, and I'd walked perhaps half a mile. There were a cluster of bright stars directly ahead of me, and I was kind of using them for light. But while I was looking at them, the top one went out. And I thought, well, that's funny. Stars don't do that, and at least on a clear night. Something is between me and that star that I can't see. And I focused my attention on that space in the sky where the stars were, and presently another one just beside it went out. And presently, a little later, 2 more down below went out. And I thought, well, something is coming, and coming directly toward me, because the bearing remained constant. If it had been at an angle, the first stars would have come back in sight, and some other star would have gone out. But the apparent size of the thing just kept increasing, although I couldn't see anything at first what it was at all. Finally, I did see what it was, and realized why I couldn't see it before, because it reflected very little light. And it was an oblate spheroid, and somewhat flattened at top and bottom. It was approaching and apparently slowing down as it approached. I had a strong inclination to run at first, but one of the first things you learn in rocketry work or dynamite work, and I had done that for years before, is to stand still until you're sure of the trajectory of a flying object before you start to run, because you can't judge its trajectory while you're running. And you're just liable to run into that trajectory as you are to run away from it. So I stood still and for a moment and watched the thing. And then I could see that there was something approaching. And it was coming down at an angle of about 45 degrees, which kept the stars, it kept it hiding the stars. But it seemed to be slowing up as it got closer to the ground, and I thought, well, by the time it reaches the ground, it'll be at 0 velocity. It must have a control on it, which controls its speed to the distance remaining between it and the ground. By the time it reaches the ground, it will be at 0 velocity, so there won't be any crack. And I thought, well, that some high technology in this thing anyway. And then I observed that it had no wings. It was an oblate spheroid. The sphere flattened at top and bottom, and it was just drifting in as light as a drifting star. And I tried to think what that thing could be. I tried to answer, I tried to explain it in earthly terms, and I found I couldn't. We didn't have anything like that. Everything we have has wings or some rocketry mechanism that expels incandescent gases to produce thrust. We have a number of ways of making thrust. This didn't have any of them, and it didn't make any noise. So I began to wonder where that could have come from. And it eventually touched ground about 70 feet from where I was standing at almost zero velocity. And I looked at it, and if it had made the slightest move or sound, I think I would have been running yet. But it didn't. It was completely quiet. And I stood and looked at it for what seemed like a long time, but it was probably not more than a minute or so. And my curiosity began to overcome my fear. And I found I was approaching the thing a step at a time, a step and a pause, and a step and a pause. And I heard no sound and saw no movement, so my curiosity got stronger as my will got weaker. I knew I should have been running in the other direction as fast as I could go. And I really wanted to, but something was forcing me to. My curiosity, I think, when you're in a business like that is, and you work years and years for just one little advance, and then you see something that destroys your whole idea of technology. It displays a technology that you never even thought of having. Well, it affects you quite strongly, and you've got to find out what that thing is. So I approached within a few steps of the thing and walked around it. It remained completely silent, completely motionless. And then I stopped and thought, well, what should I do? Should I go back to the base and announce the arrival of this craft and get some people to come out and look at it? And I actually started to do it. I'd taken a couple of steps, and then this horrifying thought came to me: if I take that long to go into the base and get someone to come out, this will probably be gone when they get here, and there won't be anything but a crushed patch of brush where I said a spaceship would be. And I knew what that would mean to me. It just meant that I wouldn't work, because I had a job in which the lives of my fellow workmen were frequently dependent upon the accuracy of my judgment. And people don't hire mentally unstable people for such a job. And I had never, as far as I knew, had hallucinations, nor had I ever been insane, and I didn't drink. And so I thought I'd better just stay here and see what I can find out and hope that I survive long enough to get some evidence behind what I'll be saying. It didn't seem that there was any way I could get evidence right at first, and then it occurred to me I hadn't touched the craft yet. I could at least tell the temperature of the surface of the craft. And that would be a bit of data which would be important, because it was after sundown, and that craft had come in either from the sunlit side of the Earth or the night side of the Earth. If it had come in from the night side of the Earth, it would have lost quite a bit of temperature on the last legs of the trip and should be fairly cool. If it had come in on the sunlit side, why the air friction would have produced a little more friction and should be warmer than the air. So at least I could find out one thing by touching the surface. And I had realized I hadn't touched it yet, although I'd been close enough to touch it for several minutes. So I took a step forward and I put one finger on the craft. I was immediately surprised not by the temperature, but although it did appear a few degrees warmer, from which I deduced that it did come in on the sunlit side. But no matter how hard I pressed down, I could not produce any friction between my finger and the finger simply slipped around on the craft as though there were a million microscopic ball bearings between my finger and the craft. And being accustomed to very high polished surfaces and so forth, nevertheless, on the highest polished surface you can make, your finger will drag you if you press down. The oil in your skin will do it if nothing else. And this, no matter how hard I pressed down, just drifted around as though there were ball bearings under it. So I began to stroke the craft with the palm of my hand, and I could feel what seemed very definitely as though there were some eddy currents generated in the hand by the motion of the hand over the craft. And at that point I was addressed by a voice. And I know now people are saying, oh, now we know he's crazy because he's hearing voices. Well, I had been hearing voices for several years in that position because I set up the recording devices in the test bay while my friend was setting up the rockets in the firing bay. And we had a communication system up on the wall. It was just a communication system. It wasn't a telephone or anything. And I just spoke and he spoke to me. We spoke back and forth just as though we were in the same room. And we were well occasioned to that. We were speaking all the time to people we couldn't see. But I had miscalculated the amount of tension that was built up in my system by all this questioning. When that voice crackled out of the air, and I put down in the book what it said. It was the greatest temptation not to. Because it was the one thing that was criticized more than anything else in the book. Because it sounded so Hollywoodish that a person couldn't believe that an outer space person would say it. The words were, better not touch the hull, pal, it's still hot. Yeah. And believe me, if I could have thought of any way of getting out of this without ruining the truth, I would have done it. I was glad I would. It was with the greatest of reluctance that I wrote that in the book, but it was said and it had to be. It was said. When that startling voice came out from beside me or wherever it sounded like it was coming from, I leaped backwards several feet. I got my feet tangled in a brush and I sprawled out at full length on the sand. The sand were in my hair. And our mind works very rapidly, of course, at times like this. Lots of people have asked me if my past life didn't flash before my face. I had to admit that it did not. I was very much concerned about the present and the immediate future. But I did, my mind did work in that thing. And I was thinking, if this craft was made somewhere else, and it obviously was, and if there's somebody in it, there wasn't, but I didn't know that. The voice just came from the craft itself as though someone would be. If there is someone in it, and that someone originated somewhere other than this world, I am probably displaying the most ridiculous mien that any foreign person ever displayed to a visiting fireman or whatever. I got up and brushed myself off and pulled a sandburr out of my hair. I said something almost as ridiculous. I said, you could have turned the volume down a little. You scared me out of a week's growth. I was almost thinking that it had to be somebody from Earth that had made the thing, that it couldn't have been. The voice sounded so American and so normal that I almost was convinced that it was someone from this planet. And the voice spoke again and assured that I was about to kill myself and I didn't have time to diddle with controls, was the words that were used. So the individual obviously had not had time to study an English grammar, was just repeating the language the way he'd heard it on radio or television, or however he'd learned the language. He was just using it the way he'd heard it, and had never studied an English grammar. That thought occurred to me while I was getting up, that maybe it was an alien, but one that hadn't studied an English grammar. So I got up and I began to protest a little voluble about the volume of the sound, and he said, oh, well, you were about to kill yourself. And I said, well, what do you mean I was about to kill myself? I did touch the craft, and I didn't get any shock or anything, and I did rub it with my hand. And he said, there is a field mechanism about the craft which repels all other matter. One of your scientists would call it the antiparticle of the gravitational field. But we use it because it assists us greatly in landing. It keeps the craft from being scratched. But it has a very short field length. It obeys the seventh power law instead of the usual law that fields do. And I didn't know what that meant, but I looked it up in the physics books and found out what it meant, and there was a seventh power law. It just means that your finger gets very close to the surface before you begin to feel the effects of the thing. But the resistance can be very strong from there on. So it would protect the craft against scratching or damaging and landing. And it would create a laminar flow if the craft is traveling in an atmosphere or in any gas situation. The gas would flow along the sides of it in the laminar flow, that is, there are layers that would flow in, and so would not transmit any noticeable heat to the surface of the craft. We have wondered how they can travel so fast in an atmosphere and not burn up. But that's how he explained how he did it, because field mechanism produces a laminar flow that doesn't allow the atmosphere, the air, to actually touch the craft. It just flows along the side of it in laminar flow. Anyhow, I'm getting away from my subject, and I'll be boring people, because if they don't understand what I'm talking about, they won't know whether I know what I'm talking about or not. So anyway, I had learned one thing. I learned that I could make remarks and get answers, or I could ask questions and get answers. And you may well believe that I became very full of questions, probably even as full as you are now. But I found that I could get answers, and a very lively conversation ensued, during which time I learned a few things. I learned that the craft, the device, was a freight carrier, just an ordinary freight carrier, and it was being used at that time to take samples of Earth's atmosphere at ground level from various isolated points on the surface of the planet. That there was a valve on the top. It was sent down. The craft that controlled it was in space, open space. It was just shot out into space. And the valve was open, whereupon any atmosphere that was in it would escape, because it was in the void of space. Then the valve was closed again. It was set down on our planet, on Earth, and the valve was opened again, and our air would rush in. And they would have a very complete sample of our atmosphere, complete with all microorganisms and so forth that inhabited that area, in which that they were planning. One person was planning to spend time on this planet as a born citizen here, if it was possible, and they thought it was possible. There didn't seem to be too many things that had to be done, and that person could take up life on this planet as a regularly born citizen of this planet. And this would take some time, and they had to have one person here to set up arrangements for this person before he sat down. If he were trapped at the moment of landing, he wouldn't have any answer. If I had joined him, I could and would set up a small bank account in this gentleman's name before he arrived, rent a small apartment for him in his name before he arrived. If he was questioned or captured immediately upon arrival, he could say, well, I live here, I've always lived here, I have a job, I have a bank account in a little bank in San Francisco, I have an apartment here that I pay rent on. Of course I am a citizen of this planet. And he could have defended himself against any accusation of being an alien on the day he arrived. That was the thing, and I had to get for him one thing, mainly. And it was against the law. Almost everything I did was against the law. That's why I was not anxious to do it for a long time. Because I could have gone to jail for a long time, although no one was injured, no one was hurt in any way. And in fact, everybody whose life had been threatened was saved. But people don't realize the fact that there are laws against these things and in favor of these things. It would be almost impossible for a person to visit this country legally if he were an alien. There's nothing ever been prepared for that to happen. There's no way you can do it legally, because it was never envisioned by anyone. Nobody believed in extraterrestrials anyhow, so why should we make laws to govern their arrival here? If a spacecraft flew into our atmosphere to seek admission to the United States, they would be in violation of the law the minute they entered our airspace, because we have laws that say you can't fly a craft until it's licensed, and a spacecraft would not have a license. And if one such craft landed on any territory of the United States, and if an alien got out and stepped on the ground, he would be in violation of so many laws that it would take a half an hour to read the charges against him. And the people who had read the charges would say, well, we didn't make these laws, we just have to enforce them. It's just our job to enforce them, and they would. There is no way that an alien to this planet could legally visit this country unless a special law were made to allow them to. And nobody's ever done that yet. There is no law that allows an alien to land here, and they can't do it legally. So many people I've heard say, well, why don't they just land on the White House lawn and so forth and so forth. Not realizing it's against the law to go in the air with anywhere within 10 miles of that 10-mile square of the White House. And that the ones that did do it, probably unknowing of this law here a few years back, did penetrate the airspace around the Capitol, were pursued very violently and viciously and quickly, and they had to disappear. They came back after, as soon as the pursuit craft had landed, they came back and wondering what all the fuss was about, to see what was down there. But it illustrated what would happen if they had tried to land. They would have been arrested immediately, just out of natural course, because they were violating the law, and it had to have been. And anyway, there are so many, as I say, there are so many laws they would be violating. They would take a half an hour or more just to read the charges against them when they were arrested. And it's unlikely that they would ever be released, because the government would say, oh boy, we took all the things all the knowledge we can get from these people. We don't want to release him while we'll learn from him. We'll just keep and learn from him. And we'll probably never release him. But anyhow, whether they would or not is something that they don't want to take any chance on finding out. Apparently, they wouldn't be released. Apparently, they would be kept anyhow, and they know it. And they would have to demonstrate superior powers and so forth. And if they did, they would be violating other laws. And they could really get in Dutch. And really, most of the ones that want to visit this planet are law-abiding people. And if you're a law-abiding person, you can't visit this country, because the laws have never been prepared. There have never been any laws prepared for anyone to do it. And however desirable it would be, they couldn't do it without breaking the law. Anyway, I'm getting away from my story. They realized that they were going to have help from somebody here. Somebody's going to have to get, if a person was going to take up life on this planet as an ordinary earthborn citizen, he would have to have a birth certificate. That's the first thing he'd have to have if he's going to travel. Because he'd have to get, first place, a birth certificate, and also another little paper that you have to have if you're going to travel. How many of you have traveled in foreign countries where you have to have a birth certificate? You can't even get out of a port without a birth certificate. And if they felt that if they went in and to some county recorder and says, well, look, bud, we're from space and we'd like to get a birth certificate, they didn't think that it would be successful. And I didn't think so either. They had to have someone that was born here do it, and who could understand logic or persuasion, or because it was against the law for him to do it too, he could be jailed for doing it. Because, as I say, there's just no provision for that sort of thing ever been made in law. And so, accordingly, all these things would be against the law that had to be done before he could visit. And somebody had to do it, and it had to be somebody that was here. It had to be someone that wasn't too high, because the people that are high up are observed very closely. The people who are just ordinary workmen can get away with almost anything without observation. And I happen to know a county recorder quite closely. I don't know how much that had to do with it, but that was mentioned in the recording, that I probably could persuade the gentleman to furnish him a birth certificate. They said they were perfectly aware of the fact that they could get a birth certificate. In their investigations, their mental investigations, they had found several recorders, county recorders, that were in the employ of the Soviet Union, who were making birth certificates by the dozens for Soviets to work over here, that there were some in almost every ammunition plant or so forth that we've got. There were some Soviet workers who had phony birth certificates. But they felt that a person who gained his living deliberately violating law for the sole purpose of getting money was not a safe person to deal with. Could get him in trouble at any time, and they didn't want to have anything to do with him. So we got an honest one eventually. The gentleman has been in this country most of the time ever since. He's now a long time, well, he hasn't been in this country, he's been in Europe because, or in Asia, Eurasia, or in the Near East because that's where World War III was known to be more likely to start than anywhere else. And has, in fact, been their presence that has kept it from really going off the deep end. It has come very close several times to becoming total chaos. And well, we have feared that it would be. I mean, our people over there feared that it would become total chaos. And so they had to try, but he kept it down and it never really exploded. It got pretty violent at times. But that's been his particular purpose, to keep that area from exploding, which he's done quite a good job about. And he has, as far as I know, he now could pick up a telephone from anywhere and phone me, and has done a couple of times, or could use any other communication, because as far as I know, there are only 4 people who know on Earth that know that he is alien to the planet. There are thousands of people who know this gentleman. I've been to Cairo 3 times and visited him without anyone suspecting that I was visiting an alien. But he has a device which is easy to talk about, but not very easy to explain. I could only call it electrically energized telepathy, which he can keep in touch with the minds of those people who have their finger on the big red button. And can, if he needs to, inject a few little bits of common sense and reason and pictures in the mind. If someone is about to push the big red button, he can make that person see what will happen if he does. And it's always been enough to dissuade him from doing it. Because the picture of a few million people going down the drain being burned to death, and roasted to death and so forth is not a beautiful picture. And if you think it's going to happen to you, you'll think twice before you push the button. So far, it has kept, at least from complete warfare over there. There are always people who are shooting at each other over there, but then there always have been. He can't spread his whatever powers he has that far, and besides he isn't allowed to. He isn't really allowed to do anything against the will of the person whom he's dealing with at the moment. He could, but he isn't allowed to. He could make that person think that what he was doing was his own idea and would benefit him. But at the same time, he would have a picture in his mind of what would happen if he did. So far, the system has worked. Alan doesn't know how long he will have to stay in that thankless position. And if he doesn't have to, he might write a book or something telling the world who he was, and I don't think anyone would believe him, so it wouldn't make any difference. He'd still be a single person to everybody else. I don't know how much time I've taken up, or how much time I was supposed to take up. I think everybody else went a little too long and got late, so perhaps I should call the rest of it off and get a few questions and then let somebody else take it. Yes.
This was Elan?
This was
the
Elan,
alien.
yes.
And what year did he start living on this planet?
1954.
54, thank you.
Mm. Do we have any other questions? I know we're going to have lots of questions.
How did you happen to meet it for the first time?
I own a piece of ground up in Oregon, which is at the end of a road, which leads to my place and goes nowhere from there. Nobody ever comes up there. Bad road anyway. That's where he landed for the first time. That's where I checked him for 3 days through his language to see that his language was enough Americanized to get by. Because he spoke pretty good English, but there were some old Quaker terms in there too. I mean, there's lots of people, lots of extraterrestrials who know the English language, but learned to know it as it was about 100 years ago. And almost always when someone is quoting them, they use the same language because the person does. And so they think that's right, so they'll use the language too, the same language that the alien does. But the alien doesn't know it because he got his source of English a long time ago. Some of them only have contact once every 5 or 6, 10 years, or some maybe only every 20 years. Yes?
Did he say where he's from?
Somebody always asks that question, not realizing that there's no way on earth he could tell, he could say, unless he'd stayed here several years and studied our new general catalog and see what we call it, because he certainly wouldn't call it the same thing. And there wouldn't be any way unless he pointed out on a star map or something the star about which they showed the planet in his life. This was the first planet he ever set foot on. And that is something that hardly anyone realizes, anyone thinks, that races, when they have gone along so long, abandon their planets. They find it's easier to live in space. We will do it probably in about 30, 40 years. We'll practically abandon the planet. 50 years maybe, it'll be completely abandoned. Because it's much easier to live in space, much safer to live in space. We never had anyone die in space except with the explosion of our vehicle, and that was silly. I mean, when I heard that thing had taken off, I groaned in spirit because I knew it was going to go. The fuel that they use on those solid, and it wasn't the hydrogen explosion that did any damage, because that hydrogen wasn't under enough pressure and wouldn't explode fast enough, because you have to mix it with oxygen first before it will explode, and at the elevation that it had reached there wasn't much oxygen. While it would have made some moisture and some fog around it, it wouldn't have made an explosion. But the 10 feet, the vortex 10 feet of the solid rocket exploded, and it certainly would. I mean, it would 9 times out of 10. After it's been under below freezing pressure for hours and hours, that grain develops thousands of minute cracks in it. The grain always did. It did. I know it. I learned that 20 years ago. That grain has small cracks, and when you fire, if you fire that grain, the fire goes immediately into the cracks and expands the cracks, and enlarges the grain thereby, because it develops internal pressure in the grain and enlarges the grain, and finally extrudes the grain through the venturi. And when it does that, it seals the venturi, and the whole thing blows up. And it lost the last 10 feet. If anyone who took a picture of that, Newsweek magazine published a picture and says what happened. You can take one look at it and know what happened. The last 10 feet of one of the solid grains is gone. And not only that, but you can see where these burning solid grains, pieces of burning solid grains, are flying out in all directions from the same place where the grain exploded. It can't be anything else. There's nothing else that burns fast enough to make a solid plume of smoke right behind the burning object. Nothing else makes that much smoke except the cold rocket fuel exploding. That is that particular rocket fuel. And I worked with it 20 years before the company that's handling it now ever was set up. And we had explosions every time we had a grain that got below freezing for any length of time. It would explode. And there wasn't anyone there that had worked over there that long to know that was, and I don't know whether they know it yet. If they don't know it yet, they'll freeze some other grains and kill some other people. But their explanation was that it was the explosion of the hydrogen tank. And they showed the escape of flame from the solid rocket, which they said exploded the hydrogen tank. Well, it might have burned through from the outside, burning into. I doubt it, if it could, or if it did. But if it did, it might have burned through. The hydrogen might have escaped in a plume and burned as it mixed with the oxygen of the air that was available there. They were up, what was it, 200,000 feet or close to. They were almost in a vacuum already when the explosion took place. And it was the explosion of the solid rocket motor that burst the hydrogen tank in the other. It wasn't the flame of gas escaping from the hydrogen tank. I don't know whether the so-called experts in the company know that or not. They should. If they don't, they shouldn't be working where they are. They shouldn't be working where they are. They should be working somewhere else. Because we had dozens and dozens of people that had experience with that 20 years before, and knew that if you freeze one of those grains, they develop 1,000 little cracks, and when you fire them, then the fire runs right down into the crack, and the crack becomes bigger, and the burning surface gets twice as big as it was supposed to be, and your pressure goes up, and the more your pressure goes up, the faster the burning rate gets, and the faster the burning rate gets, the faster the pressure goes up, until the whole thing explodes. Pardon? Yes.
Can you tell us, when you talk about this alien, we're talking somebody that looks like us, or 4 foot tall? Or
He does now. No, he looks like us now. I don't know. I can't say what he looked like first because I didn't see him until he'd had 4 years of acclimation to this planet. I talked with him, but I didn't see him for 4 years. Pardon?
You're 6 feet tall?
No, he's slightly smaller than average here. Slightly smaller. But you wouldn't notice him. His own statement was, "My first real test will come when I walk down the street of any of your major cities. And if anyone turns his head to look at me, I will know I have failed. That I have to do something to become more ordinary. Because I have to become so ordinary that no one would think of turning his head to look at me." That's the line. He had to be so ordinary in order to walk the streets that no one would even think of turning his head to look at him. If they did, he'd failed somewhere because they shouldn't be that much different. He shouldn't create that much curiosity. He couldn't be rich, he couldn't be poor. Because to be rich invites envy, to be poor invites, yeah. Pardon? No, I don't know how old he is because one thing, his age wouldn't have any reference to Earth anyhow because he wasn't born here, and he wasn't born on any planet. In fact, he was born in a spaceship, as about 60% of our technical population has been in this galaxy, this entire galaxy, when they were born on any planet, because it's easier to build spaceships and live in them, and safer. Well, we'll hope that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened yet. It's one of the things that could upset the apple cart. Because his blood isn't quite the same as any that we know of here. You'd have to analyze it to find it out. But he can't take a blood transfusion normally. But he doesn't have to. I mean, so far he's lived a life such that he hasn't needed to have any of our surgery.
Are there any others that you know about?
Not that I know about. I don't doubt that there are. I wouldn't make a guess as to how many, though. But I think, because I know that there is one, I think there are probably some others. Yes?
Does he experience emotion like humans do?
Well, not as extreme. I've never seen him throw a tantrum or exhibit extreme emotion. He is quite relaxed and quite dignified, and I've never really seen him get angry, real angry about anything. I know a lady in Sweden when I was lecturing in Sweden, and that was the biggest lecture I ever gave. I mean, we had a hall that held about 1,500, and we turned away 500 from that hall in Sweden. But there was a lady in the front row who was active in the largest newspaper in Sweden. And when the question period came, she says, "Would you say that they could have a sense of humor?" And without thinking, without hesitating, without thinking, I says, "Madam, if they're going to deal with us, they have to have it." Anyway, she thought it was very funny, and everybody else thought it was very funny, and there were people rolling in the street. But it was in headlines in the next day's paper in Sweden.
How did you make the transition from that standing there and confronting this object to going along this whole plan?
Well, it took almost a year to make up my mind. I was given a year to decide whether I wanted to become a part of that or not. If I decided no, the only thing was I would have been given a dose of forgetfulness as it was, and I'd forgotten the whole thing. That's the only. There was no penalty for refusal, and I had a year to decide whether I wanted to take part. Because, as I said, there was no pay, no benefit. I'd never get rich from it. And I might lose most of my friends because I couldn't explain to them the peculiarities of things I was doing. But they had come a long ways, and they weren't getting any pay either.
So what do they think about you talking about this?
Pardon?
What do they think about you talking about this?
Well, he's been here long enough now so that I don't think anyone's going to arrest him. If anyone accused him of being an alien now, the police would probably say, "Oh, go sleep it off." You know.
What kind of work is he doing? I mean, generally?
Generally, he is keeping track of the processes of the mind of the people who have control of the big red button. I said a little while back, when everyone gets ready to press that button, he injects into their mind a few words of counsel and guidance and so forth. And if that doesn't work, then he'll show them what will happen if it does with that. But they don't know that. They don't know they're being acted upon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry to cut it off.
Yeah.
But we do have the time. Okay, we'll take a short break and we'll come back and hear Vicki Cooper from UFO Magazine.